Sometimes, love is mistaken for possessiveness, and temperament and charisma for bad character. It's unfortunate that such mistakes in some situations can be fatal, as was the case with the protagonists of today's story. On Monday, July 3, 2012, in the quiet small town of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, USA, car mechanics were diligently working on their cars in their garages. Frank Spencer's friend, Joe, hadn't heard from his buddy since the beginning of the weekend. At this point, the team was in the middle of a series they aimed to win, with a good chance of victory. However, after the last races, problems with the cars arose. Joe needed advice, so he decided to visit Frank at home. He didn't answer his mobile phone, which was turned off. As Joe searched for his friend, he jokingly thought, "I hope I haven't found him dead," and he had a good reason for these grim thoughts. Joe drove to his friend's house and was immediately alarmed. The front door was ajar, and there were bloodstains on the doorstep. Joe's worst fears were confirmed. The best friend of the racer was found in the house, lying on the floor and showing no signs of life. This energetic, active man now appeared calmer than ever before. Joe stood in shock for a few seconds, frozen and unable to move. He silently stared at his friend, knowing he would never shake his hand again. Walking around the body, he saw dried blood oozing from a gunshot wound near the ear. He then called emergency services and reported the gruesome discovery. Joe was sure who was behind the crime. In 1977, Frank Spencer and his lover Maria were crazy about each other. Their parents disapproved of the relationship and tried for a long time to prevent it, but the couple did not give up. Eventually, the lovers decided to take action. They ran away from home and rented an apartment far from their families. After some time, their relationship was finally accepted. The families realized that further nagging would only make things worse, and they didn't want to lose contact with the young couple. Maria and Frank married and first had a son, then a daughter. Afterwards, the young family moved into a house where they began to create a cozy nest. Frank worked hard and tirelessly, always putting his family first. He built his career and expanded his business to provide everything his family needed. His father shared the same vision. Frank's father ran the business for many years, and after his retirement, his son took over. According to Frank's friends, Maria had a less warm attitude toward family and married life. Indeed, Maria showed little interest in the children, seemed to be her own person, and was not particularly concerned with domestic matters. Maria cared mostly about money and liked to spend it. Against this backdrop, an almost complete indifference of the mother toward her own children, the marriage gradually began to shake. In 2006, the couple decided to file for divorce, initiated by Frank. He was tired of the constant disagreements and arguments. His wife's outbursts became simply unbearable. She behaved so inappropriately that the man feared for the children's health. During this time, the relationship heated up to the maximum. After deciding to end the marriage, even more serious disputes began. Frank wanted to keep the children with him, as he was sure his wife would not take proper care of them. However, there were people in his circle who disagreed with this point of view. His friend Ron believed that contact with both parents was necessary for the children and that a custody agreement should be reached by dividing it between the two. Frank was not opposed to the mother seeing the children, but he wanted to protect them from the carelessness and potential danger posed by Maria. One way or another, the woman wanted sole custody despite her ex-husband, as this would mean she could count on significant alimony payments. She did not want to work. On this basis, it led to serious conflicts between the former spouses. They continued regularly every time they talked about the divorce and the division of custody. Frank repeatedly called the police to the house because Maria behaved inappropriately towards him and the children. She threw herself at everyone. In 2008, Maria had to be arrested due to a dispute with Frank's mother that occurred directly at the school of their common child. Maria wanted to pick up the girl, and the former mother-in-law tried to prevent this because it was a spontaneous decision by the mother, and they already had another appointment for that day. After the argument was over, the mother drove the girl away in her car, but she forgot to buckle her up, which the patrol officers noticed who stopped the car. The woman's behavior was seen as a threat to the life and health of the child. Against this background, Maria came into conflict with the law, and a criminal case was initiated against her. In addition, Frank described her as a stalker and claimed that she was following him. A case was initiated, but the prosecutor believed there was not enough evidence and proof to demonstrate a threat to the life of the children. Maria was offered a deal. She pleaded guilty to bullying and harassment, but the charge of alleged endangerment of her daughter's life was dropped. She was ultimately fined $600 for her behavior, but even the penalty did not lead the negligent mother to reconsider her behavior. On the contrary, Maria became even more bitter, especially towards her ex-husband. From this point on, Frank's friends and family were increasingly confronted with his complaints. He said Maria had begun to threaten and harass him without embarrassing other people. After some time, there were many witnesses who heard these threats with their own ears. Frank continued to remain calm and tried to document all incidents so that he could go to the police. He wanted the matter to stop because Maria had clearly overreacted. In 2009, the divorce proceedings were still not concluded. At this point, 3 years had already passed, but the dispute was far from over. The children had lived with her, their mother, all the time. Despite the difficulties with his former wife, Frank wanted to move on. During this time, he met another woman named Julie Dent. The couple got to know each other through mutual friends and soon began a serious relationship, which the stalker quickly learned about. The situation escalated when the rumors reached Maria. According to her, she didn't care that Julie spent time with Frank, but the fact that a stranger was interacting with her children upset her very much. Frank considered this a lie since Julie had always been very nice to his children and had taken better care of them than their own mother. In his opinion, the real motive for Maria's aggression was jealousy. From that moment, a new round of deterioration in the relationships with her ex-husband began. This was also contributed to by a man named Anthony Rock Franklin, Maria's father, being released from prison. He had served his 5-year sentence for fraud. This was very bad news for Frank because Rock had a cool temperament, a bad reputation, and was a quite violent and aggressive man. Many believed that Maria's character was precisely in him. Frank's relatives noticed during this time that he was constantly worried. He began to develop paranoia, which turned out to be not unfounded. Just a few months after Rock's release, burglars broke into Spencer's office, which Frank led. Nothing valuable was stolen from the business owner, but documents were missing from his private office that could help Maria get alimony from her husband. She planned to open his business records, apparently to find some irregularities. The morning after the incident, Frank received a call from Maria. Her words sounded absurd. The woman said she had found a trash bag with his documents on her porch, where it had been lying since the morning. No one in Frank's office could be proven to have participated in the burglary. According to law enforcement, the perpetrator left no traces that could be traced back to him. However, friends and acquaintances of Frank were convinced that only 2 people could have committed the burglary: the victim's ex-wife and her father, Rock, who had recently been released from prison. The investigators examined the burglary site and approached Marie as the main suspect but could not prove her involvement. Finally, the investigations were stopped because no conclusive evidence against the perpetrators could be found. Due to the activity of law enforcement, Maria handed these documents over to her lawyer, who decided that they should be returned to the owner. Apparently, he found nothing important in the documents that could be used against her ex-husband. This robbery has not been solved to this day. Of course, most people knew whose work it was. The situation escalated further. After these events, Frank complained about the threats on social media that he regularly received from his ex-wife. In social media, she repeatedly expressed her displeasure with the way his new wife dealt with their children. The mother was very jealous of Julie, who spent a lot of time with their small children. Their internet disputes lasted until the winter of 2010. During this time, Frank seemed to lose patience again, and he turned to law enforcement. He reported the threats and presented the conversation with his ex-wife so that the investigators could assess Maria's behavior. The ex-wife claimed she didn't mean it badly and that it wasn't really threats, just a special way of communicating. The woman lost her composure during uncomfortable conversations with her ex-husband, so her words could not be interpreted as threats. Maria really wrote in a veiled manner, making it harder to prove her guilt, which logically had failed so far. Meanwhile, Frank and his new lover Julie were preparing for a romantic trip in January 2011. The couple wanted to visit the Caribbean. Unfortunately, Maria also learned of these plans. She began to write and called Julie to prove that her ex-husband did not love his new wife and that they still had a romantic relationship despite the divorce. Maria even arranged a meeting to which she lured Julie out and had a hateful conversation with her. Meanwhile, Julie tried to persuade Maria to leave the two alone, but it didn't work. From then on, things got even worse. One unfortunate evening, a fire broke out at Frank's house. His friends and neighbors learned about it. People immediately rushed to the house. They were sure that Frank had died in the fire. It seemed that the owner of the house was in the house and asleep, and his ex managed to commit the planned murder. Fortunately, Frank was not injured since he was not in the house at the time. As his friends and acquaintances stood in the driveway and watched the house burn down, Maria also drove up. She watched silently and smiling, then turned around and drove away wordlessly. That night, the house was actually empty. The only one in it was the dog of one of the children of the estranged couple, who unfortunately died in the fire. Frank turned to law enforcement again. He was convinced that the ex-wife had set the fire. In his opinion, the whole thing was no joke anymore but a serious threat to him and his family. Now the ex-wife had let actions follow words, and he had miraculously remained unharmed. But as with all other claims of the man, the police said there was no evidence because they had burned in the fire. The fire was documented as a result of a technical error. This fire case became another unsolved case involving Spencer. Surprisingly, Frank was unable to obtain trivial defense against harassment from the police officers, although there were obvious signs of Maria's involvement in these events. It seemed to him as if the police were in cahoots with the family. Finally, one of the police officers tried to pursue the alleged perpetrator and talk to him, as the fire chief had already prepared an official report about the accident. Unfortunately, an investigation was not possible. Nevertheless, the police officer was convinced that the arson could not have been an accident, especially against the background of the couple's long problematic relationship. Afterward, Maria sent Frank several text messages in which she mocked him. She accused him of having ruined her life and described what had happened as karma that he deserved. The stalker let the situation escalate further and sent several similar messages to Julie, claiming that she would be next. Of course, the police could not find anything reprehensible in these messages either. Since Maria remained unpunished, her arrogance only grew. She was no longer so anxious that she made several public threats against her ex-husband and his life partner. Apparently, she did not want to leave it at mere words. Only a few weeks later, a fire broke out in Julie's apartment. The worst thing was that she was at home at the time and had to jump from the roof of the porch to save herself. Fortunately, the woman remained unharmed, but her belongings burned, and she became homeless. Of course, she recognized from the similar handwriting that the incident was related to the fire at Frank's house. Julie's house did not burn down completely but was uninhabitable. Frank and Julie thought they could find some evidence in the ashes. In addition, the house was in a different district, so the desperate couple hoped for more interest from the police. But this time, too, the officers simply gave up. After a long conversation with the victims, the investigators said that there was no evidence and that the fire would be dismissed as an accident. Julie had to turn to a higher authority to force the police to investigate the incident, which advanced the case. Traces of flammable signal lamps, which could have been used for ignition, were found in her yard. One of the items was lying in the grass near the house, and it was also possible to find another of this kind, which apparently was the cause of the fire. The stairs to the house's terrace had been doused with gasoline. After careful consideration, the authorities finally admitted that the fire was due to arson. However, with that, the case was closed, and the culprit was never identified. Of course, both Frank and Julie immediately blamed Maria, who had been pursuing her ex-husband for a long time. Just before the incident, she had even threatened a fire. After the couple's relationship began, Maria began stalking her ex-husband under various pretexts. The threats became regular, and after her father was released from prison, this criminal couple seemed to spring into action. Despite the clear evidence of harassment, the police did not press charges for lack of evidence. The situation worsened further. In June 2012, Frank and Julie decided to separate for a while. In this way, they wanted to deceive Maria and give her a chance to calm down. To make it credible, they even wrote their story in the newspaper. This event coincided with the final divorce of the former spouses. The very next day, Frank was found dead. The family of the deceased immediately suspected the former wife of being involved in Frank's murder. The divorce of the couple had been finalized just one day before the murder, and new threats were allowed because Maria had not received the expected decision. From the beginning, the woman was against the divorce proceedings. The case was very controversial and protracted. The former spouses constantly clashed at every meeting. Indeed, Maria's bold and passionate temperament was initially the trait that attracted Frank. He himself had a very energetic character, which was reflected in Maria's temperament. Initially, they were inseparable and complemented each other perfectly, but over time, this roller coaster ride of the relationship became exhausting, and the relationship deteriorated. But could it have come so far that one of the parties brutally murdered the other? It was the task of the investigators to find out. When the police officers arrived at the house of the deceased, they saw large pools of blood and several extended traces as if someone had tried to remove the stains. The investigators found the first clues on the floor. A clear bloody shoe print was visible. A yellow rubber glove lay in the middle of the kitchen on the floor, and a second glove was found in the sink. When the gloves were examined for DNA traces, particles of Maria's skin were found in them. Friends of the victim claimed that she had not lived in the house for several years, which meant that the gloves could not have been left there by chance. All this indicated that the gloves had been used recently, suggesting involvement in the crime. The two suspects, Maria and her father, were arrested. In the whole town, it was said that the two were Frank's only enemies who could have wanted his death. Everyone knew about the years of harassment that Maria had staged to make her ex-husband's life hell. The arson was also blamed on Maria and her father by the neighborhood. Despite these convictions, the police needed solid evidence to bring them to court. After analysis in the forensic laboratory, these were quickly found. Frank had been shot with two different weapons. The first bullet, the forensic scientists believe, was fired from a rifle as the man stood near the front door. He probably went over to open it, and the attacker immediately began shooting. No gunpowder residues were found on the clothing, which means that the shot was fired from a considerable distance. The bullet went through the arm and hit the chest, severing a vital artery. This wound was fatal, but it was not the only one. The police suspect that the shot was fired from an appropriate distance. After the first wound, the victim was dragged into the house. Here, the attackers fired another pistol shot into the head at close range as they stood over Frank. The body showed clear traces of gunpowder gas. Obviously, the man had no signs of life at this point, so the second shot can be considered an act of revenge. The perpetrator clearly had a hatred for his victim. All this fit very well with Maria's image. If the first shot had not been fatal, the second would definitely have been fatal. The police believe that Rock had fired the rifle, and his daughter completed what he had started. The pair dragged the ex-husband into the house, threw him to the ground, and the woman shot him with the rifle. The investigators noticed that the dog and the car of the victim were missing. This gave the police new food for thought, and so the investigators decided to request recordings from traffic surveillance cameras. Soon after, the murdered man's pickup was spotted on a federal highway, presumably driven away from the house of F. This happened only a few minutes after Frank's death. Unfortunately, the recordings were too grainy to see who was behind the wheel of the vehicle. Finally, the pickup of the victim was found in the neighboring town of Sunbury, Pennsylvania, a place 40 kilometers from the victim's house and not far from the apartment where Maria lived. A short time later, the murdered man's dog was found by chance. It had been taken for his son to replace the dead animal that had not survived the first arson. Apparently, the animal was startled by gunshots and fled, but it was too far from Frank's house, which was suspicious. It was reported missing by the Spencer family, which was already quite notorious due to a sensational divorce process and harassment that everyone in the town knew about except the police. The investigators suspected that Maria wanted to pick up the dog to give it to her children later, but the animal escaped on the way while Rock was on the road in the stolen car. During the questioning of Rock, the investigators tried to find out where his shoe prints in the victim's house might have come from, but the man did not give up and told the ridiculous story that he had visited Frank the day before the murder. According to him, his daughter could not establish contact with her ex-husband, but he could get along well with him and had come by that day to help clean. Rock claimed that there were already large bloodstains on the floor of the house, which he had accidentally stepped into. Rock could not explain the blood in the house, and it was not possible to refute his statements about his friendship with the deceased. There were no witnesses who had seen conflicts with Rock, however, no one had seen that the two had been friends and interacted, so his version did not sound plausible. Moreover, the perpetrator claimed he had not stolen Frank's car, but that the deceased himself had given him the vehicle, which he supposedly wanted to buy. Rock claimed he had taken the vehicle the day before the man's death, when the deceased had come to help his former son-in-law. In this absurd way, the suspect clearly tried to justify why his fingerprints or DNA might have been found on any items at the crime scene. In fact, he immediately admitted to being present at the scene but tried to shift the timing back by 24 hours. The police needed more evidence, such as the murder weapon. However, it involved a hardened criminal who probably knew how to properly dispose of a firearm. During the search of his apartment, neither a rifle nor a pistol was found. Due to his parole, Rock was not allowed to carry a weapon. Maria did not own one either, but that did not change the fact that her father's criminal connections could have easily allowed him to obtain a weapon to kill his detested former son-in-law. Maria also refused to plead guilty to the murder. She claimed the gloves had accidentally come into her ex's house and denied any involvement in the case. Despite the ridiculous stories, the suspects were eventually released, but evidence against them continued to be collected. In the meantime, Maria went about her daily life calmly. One day, she attended her son's football game when a friend of Frank approached and tried to find out if the woman had something to do with the incident. However, she quickly saw through his intention and answered very evasively. According to her words, It seemed as though Maria had been at the crime scene and had seen her ex-husband's death, although she had not killed him herself. When the prosecutor dealt with the case, he was astonished at the indifference of the authorities towards Frank's numerous complaints against his ex-wife. All his demands were ignored, although death threats, even if veiled, represent a serious crime under the law, and the arson could be considered attempted murder. Despite the clear evidence, the investigators did not even try to thoroughly investigate the victim's claims, which puzzled the prosecution. For this reason, an internal investigation was initiated, during which the police received numerous complaints about the incompetence and negligence of the investigators. The investigators who ignored the complaints stated that they had not received any solid evidence of harassment, they had not heard any threatening voice messages, they said, nor had they been shown Frank's text correspondence. There was no way to prove negligent service, nothing was documented, and the only person who could confirm or deny the statements of the investigators was dead. The public and Frank's family were upset about this decision, but numerous complaints remained unanswered. The investigation stalled again because the investigators decided to prove not only stalking and murder but also numerous crimes committed before the man's murder. Finally, in 2013, a major interrogation was organized, and both suspects eventually agreed to speak with the police. Maria and Rock, however, pleaded not guilty to any of the 12 charges. This led to further charges of complicity, but the most important charge was the premeditated murder of Frank. The prosecution assumed that the criminals had traveled together to the crime scene. They used no public transportation to avoid attracting attention. After they had shot the defenseless victim, they fled in his car. During the investigation, the criminals were placed under house arrest, but by the end of 2014, Maria was finally taken to prison. Unfortunately, Rock had already fled by this time. Immediately after his testimony, he boarded a plane and flew to Colombia. The suspect landed in the vastness of South America. The prosecution considered this a flight attempt and clear proof of his guilt. The perpetrator could not be caught for 11 months until he was finally arrested. Rock had hidden near the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had been arrested by local police the previous week but resisted his extradition. This did not succeed, and he was sent back to his home country. In the fall of 2015, Maria stood trial for the murder of her ex-husband. She continued to deny involvement in the crime and blamed her father, who claimed she was only nearby. At the same time, numerous prosecution witnesses informed the court and the jury about the woman's long history of threats and arson. The trial lasted 9 days, after which the jury found the defendant guilty on all charges, including murder, arson, burglary, perjury, conspiracy, and threats. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. The criminal would thus never again enjoy freedom. Finally, in 2017, Rock also went to trial. Even fleeing to another country did not save him from justice, albeit much delayed. The man was clearly dissatisfied that his daughter had tried to shift all the responsibility onto him. According to the defendant, it was he who had helped her, but against the murder, it was Maria who wanted to get rid of her ex-husband. In the end, the ridiculous story of the criminal woman could not withstand the onslaught of the prosecution. Against the background of physical evidence, she looked pitiful. In the fall of 2018, Rock Franklin was found guilty of the murder of Frank Spencer. He was also found guilty of robbery and arson. Like his daughter, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, to which another 45 years were added. Custody of Maria and Frank's children was awarded to Maria's sister. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.